Welcome to the third annual American Indian Returnings Lecture. I'm Leanne Howe, and this lecture series is about Southeastern Indians coming back into the Southeast from where we were removed beginning in the 1830s. And so it's been my pleasure to host these kinds of talks that really forecast the future for American Indian people in the Southeast, as well as where we are coming from and returning to from Oklahoma. I came to UGA from Oklahoma, and so it has been my pleasure to be able to create this AIR series. This year's AIR talk is brought to you by Cherokee scholar and writer Daniel Justice. I've known Daniel since he was a PhD candidate at the University of Nebraska. We met in, of all places, Puerto Vallarta at the first Native American Literature Symposium hosted by the ALA. And I believe that was 1999? Yeah. In 1999, if you can imagine, the first symposium exclusively on Native literature, and it's really the end of the 20th century. So that was kind of a hoot and holler, and as some of you know, that means the first conference was good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, kind of a hoot and holler. And it was exactly that. But it's also at that same conference that I met Professor Jace Weaver, Director of the Institute of Native American Studies, and Laura Adams Weaver. So after these many years, here we are all happily back together and at UGA. So it's also been a wonderful starting point for friendship and scholarship. Daniel Justice received his degree in English in 2002 with a specialization in Native American literatures and a subspecialty in Native American histories. Today he holds the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Literatures and Expressive Culture, First Nation and Indigenous Studies at the University of British Columbia. I knew from our first meeting that he was someone to read and follow as a scholar, writer, beginning playwright, and a leader in the field of Indigenous literatures and histories. Some of his works include Our Fire Survives the Storm, a Cherokee literary history, Reasoning Together, in which he was one of the collective co-authors for the Native Critics Collective, which came out in 2008, and it was collectively authored. And the funny thing about it, that text is lively, rigorous, and contentious at turns. So that was another process of collectivity that was really very interesting to be a part of. Daniel Justice also writes speculative fiction or wonder works. The Way of Thorn and Thunder, The Kinship Chronicles, is a trilogy set in the Everland, the home of forest-dwelling kin and other eld folk since time immemorial. It's an ancient world mystery, and it has many layers of the sacred and the shadows. His forthcoming book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, 2018, shows the vital significance of literary expression to the political, creative, and intellectual efforts of Indigenous people today. And as I was preparing to introduce Daniel today, I was thinking a lot about the times in which we live. Fires in the West, the earthquakes that have hit Mexico and Mexico City, the continuing, raging hurricanes that have swept through this part of our hemisphere, all these events happening together. And in some ways, I think it's the efforts of Indigenous people to herald what those problems are and how we respond as humans to these critical events that we find ourselves in today. And it's another reason that I wanted to bring Daniel Justice here, because I think his work is right in the middle of these kinds of world events, as it were. So with that, I just want to welcome Daniel Justice and ask you to give him a warm UPA.
Thank you, Leanne, for that incredibly generous introduction. I'm not quite sure I can meet that level of significance, but I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you for being here. This is an amazing crowd, and I always feel so welcomed when I come here. And I was thinking earlier, it's like Old Home Week, and then I thought, it's like way Old Home Week for Cherokee. I really appreciate your welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I wanted to thank everyone who made this possible. Leanne, of course, centrally, Jace and Laura, who have been hosting me so beautifully, Shanette and her students, as well as Leanne's grad students who are here, who I had lunch with, Christine and Amanda, who helped make preparations for my travel, the English department, and everyone who I didn't mention who has been part of this. It's a rare opportunity to not only be treated so well, but to be treated so well so consistently. And every time I've come here, it's been a real treat. So thank you very much. I was gonna, since this is about returnings, and Leanne and I, one of the things we like to talk about is the returnings of Southeastern fashion to our communities. And I was going to wear my shell gorget, which is similar to the one Leanne is wearing. But then, before I came here, I got a little gift in the mail, and I have a necklace on. The necklace has two beads. One is stone and one is shell. And it just happens that a few days before I flew down, a friend of mine who's a Métis poet in Ontario sent me a little package. And in the package were trade beads from the 1700s. The stone one comes from Stone Lake, Tennessee, and stone comes from Judicola Rock, North Carolina, and the stone one comes from Stone Lake in Tennessee. So he actually sent it to me to take back home as a little bit of our ancestral home with me going forward. So I thought that was an appropriate bit of fashion to bring back. So I want to start with just a snippet from a poem by Kim Shuck, a Cherokee Nation poet. The poem is Smuggling Cherokee. The man asks me, "Do you speak Cherokee?" But it's all I ever speak, the end goal of several generations of a smuggling project. We've slipped the barriers, evaded border guards. I smile, always. My thoughts today, as so often, attend to both the transformative and disfiguring power of stories. Those we tell, along with those that others tell about us. They're about how stories can either strengthen, wound, or seemingly erase our humanity and shared connections, and how our stories are expressed or repressed, shared or isolated, recognized or dismissed. Stories are bigger than the texts and the bodies that carry them. When absent, they leave gaps that communicate as surely as presences. My talk today is a meditation on what happens when the meaningful stories of our place and belonging are denied to us, and how, through their returning, we can knit the jagged edges of our histories across the woundings of time, space, and experience. The theme of this series, Returning, is a powerful concept, especially for the descendants of the tens of thousands of southeastern Indian people who were removed from this region and who, for generations, have carried both the memory of the place and its loss. What is it to be a Cherokee Nation citizen, speaking of Cherokee returnings, at the University of Georgia, with its Meigs Hall and Lumpkin House, only about 140 miles from what is now Floyd County, where my lineal grandmother, Elsie Foreman, was born, and only a few hours from where, as a married woman, she and my third great-grandfather, James Spears, joined 981 other exiles in an detachment bound for the northernmost route of the Trail of Tears. What do we do with the knowledge that my paternal family's long history, long history of dislocation and diaspora in so many ways comes back to this land, these spaces, these stories, and that our family, as so many, remains estranged from them in such significant ways, even while working to return. The legacies of removal and its home-taking ruptures are not lost on me this day in this space, but neither is the delicious satisfaction in this and all our returnings. For whether in person or in imagination, or both, we always come back home. So I grew up a nerdy, light-skinned, mixed-blood queer kid in my mom's working-class hometown of Victor, Colorado, deep in the traditional homeland of the Ute people. Her mixed German, Jewish, English kin came to the region in the early 20th century as part of the gold rush, displacing the Utes just as Cherokees were in part displaced by gold seekers here. Both sides of my family's intermingled histories and realities are marked by rupture, and those absences and gaps became more significant and troubling as I grew older. I think here of the admonition of solo writer Lee Miracle, who says, "Find freedom in the context you inherit." But here, rupture was our inheritance, though one from which it was very difficult sometimes to find freedom. If for no other reason than we didn't notice, we didn't recognize for a long time the rupture for what it was. But there were hints, and more than hints. Our fractured family history led me to a state of abject terror as a 3-year-old when I found out my daddy was an Indian. It made me impatient when Dad watched his TV westerns, especially if there were Indians on the screens, not knowing that that was one of the few places he could actually see people who looked like him. It led me to associate my mixed heritage with class shame and to want to escape to something more respectable, something far from the place I increasingly associated with a whole range of imagined deficiencies. I now embrace the complicated realities of my family and our messy, enmeshed, even shattered histories. And I've come to recognize just how formative these ruptures have been to who we are and how we abide in the world. One of the main reasons I'm in Indigenous studies and in Indigenous literary studies in particular is because in so many ways it is a discipline grounded in returnings. Returning of our stories and our histories, returning of our kinship obligations, lands, ways of being and abiding in relation to the other than human world. The work of so many respected friends and colleagues in this room as well, Leanne, Jace, Herb, Laura, Jeanette, and others, have nourished and nurtured such returnings for me as well, and continue to do so for more and more people, and I know for many people in this room. As a writer and scholar for whom story is the central axis of understanding, the absences and the hard-fought returnings of some of our stories have carried some of the deepest grief and the most transformative joy in my life. Some people are fortunate to have access to these things from cradle to grave, but not all of us have that luck. For many, our lives are a process of returning and restoring, or restoring the bonds that connect us to those who came before and to those who come after, while grappling as honestly and as fiercely as possible with the consequences of the ruptures in those relations. In both its noun and verb forms, rupture speaks of violence, violation, fragmentation, pain. It comes to Middle English from Anglo-Norman and Latin terms for breaking and tearing apart, mostly bodily limbs and bones, but also laws and customs, even social orders. It's a word that invariably refers to violence, and violence to bodies, human, geological, politic. It's never a good thing, but it's often meaningful. Our literatures are the storied archives embodied, inscribed, digitized, vocalized, that articulate our sense of belonging and wonder, the ways of meaning-making in the world and in our time. Sometimes those literatures are the stories we tell around the kitchen table, or the songs we share at ceremonial grounds. Sometimes they're spoken at a microphone at the back of a crowded coffee house, or read in solitary silence at the end of a long day. Sometimes they're discussed with vigor in a classroom, or whispered softly over a lover's damp skin. Sometimes they're rooted in what is. Sometimes they're an invocation of what might have been, and what yet could be. The wonderworks of our imaginative speculations that are more than just fantasy, but perhaps even aspirational possibility. However they're shared, wherever they come from, our literatures, our stories, speak of continuity and presence in the world today. But ruptures, too, can be read, and the absences tell stories of their own. So this will be familiar history to some people, but bear with me. In 1828, when prospectors found gold in that part of the Cherokee Territory claimed by the state of Georgia, thousands of white settlers descended on the lands of what had become the Cherokee Republic. This was followed by Georgia's brutal harassment of the nation, which was precipitated by the Republic's defiant adoption of a written constitution that affirmed the Cherokee people's collective intention to remain firmly rooted in this ancient homeland, even while explicitly disenfranchising Cherokee women and Cherokees of African heritage. That year also saw the election of Andrew Jackson, who, for some befuddling reason, has become relevant again. The Indian-hating advocate of white supremacy and Indian expulsion to the U.S. presidency. In 1830, with Jackson's support, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which provided for forcible eviction and relocation of Indians from lands desired by white Americans. The leaders of the nation, most notably Principal Chief John Ross, fought removal through all available channels. Appeals to Congress, letters to newspapers throughout the country, lawsuits brought before the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1835, however, the coercive and often overtly violent pressures of removal policy and punishing trade and commerce restrictions led a few hundred Cherokees to sign what would be known as the Treaty of Newachota with the federal government, thereby exchanging all Cherokee claims to territory for other Indians' land in the Indian Territory in what is now northeastern Oklahoma. The signatories weren't the elected leadership of the nation, which had boycotted the treaty meeting. Self-ordained leaders, the treaty party members saw surrender as the only hope for survival, and they, and the Cherokee people, paid a heavy price for that decision. So in spite of the fact that nearly 16,000 Cherokees signed petitions opposing the treaty and had no voice in its illegal and unrepresentative creation, Congress ratified the treaty in 1836. 2 years later, the vast majority of Cherokees, many enslaved African Americans, including many of Cherokee heritage, and some intermarried and allied whites were driven from their homes and rounded into pestilential concentration camps by federal soldiers and border militiamen. Weeks later, federal troops and the militiamen forced the Cherokees and other exiles onto a 1,000-mile death march that would come to be known as the Trail of Tears. And you can see multiple Trails of Tears, not just those of the nation. It's important to remember that dozens of tribes were removed as a result of the Indian Removal Act. Ours gained more notoriety only because we were considered by whites to be the most civilized Indian nation. But up to 100,000 indigenous people were uprooted as a result of this legislation. A few thousand Cherokees were already living in Indian Territory, including the members of the Treaty Party, who largely avoided the agonies of the trail through their betrayal. When the survivors of the trail arrived in their new home, and my family was actually, one branch of my family did the northern route. On the 22nd of June, 1839, 3 of the 4 leaders of the Treaty Party were executed in carefully coordinated attacks just weeks after the newcomers' arrival. These leaders were Major Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and John Ridge, who had all come to the conclusion that the nation had more to gain from surrender than continuing resistance, and their killings plunged the nation into turmoil. The Republic was quickly torn between the minority loyal to Stan Wadey, the most prominent surviving Treaty Party leader and relative of the Boudinot and Ridges, and the majority loyal to John Ross, the elected principal chief of the removed nation. Most of my Spears and Foreman ancestors were firm partisans of Chief Ross. I'm directly descended from his longtime ally, the aforementioned James Spears, who in 1839 was believed to be among John Ridge's primary executioners, and he probably was. He'd actually been thrown in jail in Athens, Tennessee for smashing a man in the head with a rock who was advocating removal. So he was pretty anti-removal. So I think we can probably assume he was involved. Yet I'm also related to Cherokees who supported the treaty, and these tangled relations complicate any easy righteousness about ancestral loyalties. In spite of the continued conflict with Wadey's own supporters, most Cherokees set themselves to the work of rebuilding the nation with the Reunification Constitution of 1839. Beyond its political and historical import for the Cherokee Nation as a whole, this document holds particular personal significance. As alongside the signatures of other extended family members, the 1839 Constitution bears James Spears' X mark signature, which is just an X. Leech Lake Ojibwe scholar Scott Lyons calls X marks, quote, a sign of consent in a context of coercion, end quote. Especially in the context of indigenous treaties with Euro-Western agents in which such signatures of assent often appear. Given that those treaties were almost always monolingual English language documents of forced negotiation and surrender. James Spears' X, alongside his English name on an English language document affirming Cherokee solidarity and sovereignty, might not immediately be legible as the same kind of sign. But the great political and kinship rupture in the nation at that time was a direct result of settler colonial land hunger and displacement policies. So the systemic context of coercion, another context we've inherited, to return to Lee Mariple's words, looms very large indeed over a document otherwise written and mobilized to affirm Cherokee nationhood, reunification, and defiance. As such, that X mark and the document on which it is said to appear, at least in transcribed versions of it, I've never seen the original. This also represents the complicated political commitments of a man whose actions both helped to tear the nation apart by helping to execute Ridge and suture it back together through his work in the Constitution, even if imperfectly and for only a little while. That X mark also represents the single material sign that I have thus far found of James's life in his own hand. And again, I haven't seen the original. All the documents say it's there. Aside from a scant handful of mentions from others, there is nothing else to indicate his existence. Nothing, that is, except for his descendants. And the only stories we have are the ones we've been able to recover from the documentary record. Nothing about his life, loves, commitments, or personality has come down in family story. No mention of his work, bloody and otherwise. No history or documents shared from generations to generation. And that's more than we have for Elsie. Most of what we found in the archive privileges the men and renders the women invisible aside from their names. Our embodied memory goes back only to Elsie's and James's grandson, my great-grandfather Amos, and only because of my dad, who is now the only living person in the family to have known him, even if only for the first 14 years of his life. Of James, we have only a gesture to an X mark and a legacy. Of Elsie, a name and the shared legacy. The archive is both imperfect crypt and site of resurrection, evidence of rupture and point of return. The nation rebuilt quickly and surpassed any expectations in its reconstruction. Male and female education seminaries and a public school system were established, along with a revived national newspaper, national capital, city improvements, homes, and farmsteads. And there's been some really amazing work on that particular era that's come right out of University of Georgia, with some of the folks right here who've done a lot of the recovery work on the land. Though plagued by financial problems and grappling with its own displacements of and conflicts with indigenous neighbors, oppression of enslaved African Americans and Black Cherokees, and continuing land hunger from white settlers, the nation still managed to establish itself firmly in its new home. This period of relative calm was shattered by the U.S. Civil War, which reignited the conflict between the Ross and Wadey parties, a conflict that exploded across the nation. Ross supported the Union, Wadey supported the Confederacy. When Union troops were pulled from Indian Territory and Confederate forces took their place, Ross was forced into alliance with the Confederates. This relationship, although made under coercion and disavowed by Ross before his death in 1866, was used to justify the victorious federal government's demand that the nation cede nearly half its territory and allow railroads access to its lands. The steps began a mass influx of white settlers into land once promised by the U.S. to remain Indian country forever. By the 1880s, the pressure was on, once again, for the extinguishment of indigenous title to the lands of Indian Territory and their transition to states fully within the legal structure and political authority of the U.S. The method used this time was direct assault on the tribal body itself through allotment, the splitting of land formerly held in common into individual parcels. For Cherokee heads of household, it was typically 160 acres. Families frequently selected their allotments together or in near proximity. After all individual tribal members received their basic allotment, the so-called surplus land was open to white settlement, thus effectively shattering contiguous tribal authority and autonomy over once collectively held lands. Cherokees weren't part of the initial allotment process, which was focused on smaller and less ostensibly civilized peoples, but subsequent congressional measures further circumscribed tribal sovereignty until, in 1898, the Dawes Commission began the process of extinguishing the Cherokee body politic, along with those last holdouts of the 5 civilized tribes, Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Creeks, and Seminoles, forcibly enrolling tribal members on what would come to be known as the Dawes allotment rolls. And this is a map of the allotment in process. So this is northeast Oklahoma, what is the political boundaries of the Cherokee Nation. And all of the orange are individual parcels that have been designated. And this is not quite at the end of the process, but it's getting closer. And then whatever wouldn't be orange would be available for broader white settlement. And then a lot of the individual parcels started to be eroded as well. Tribal laws and courts were eliminated that same year by the Curtis Act. The 5 tribes fought to establish the state of Sequoia out of the Indian Territory, which would have been an Indian majority state alongside the looming state of Oklahoma, but Republican President Theodore Roosevelt worked against their efforts in order to prevent political advances by the Democratic Party in the newly created western states. In 1906, my grandmother Pearl Clara Spears was born, most likely at home on the plot of land that would be her father's allotment. In 1907, Oklahoma and Indian Territories combined to become the single state of Oklahoma, an event that formalized the U.S. elimination of Indian title to the land and the official termination of our tribal republics in the U.S. eyes. Tribal governance receded to community-level work, and the living story of strong and self-sustaining Indian nations went underground for the first part of the 20th century, yet it was never extinguished. It was rekindled in the 1970s and remains strong today, although allotment remains the great rupture in this history, to my mind ultimately far more traumatic for us than either removal or the events that followed the Civil War, for in those circumstances the nation was gravely injured, but still largely physically intact, both in terms of land and population. Allotment utterly transformed the Cherokee body politic in what is today Oklahoma. Every Cherokee and Five Tribes family from the region has stories about the catastrophic impacts of that policy, and those who still maintain their allotments and the physical ties to the land, history, and culture that accompany it are the fortunate exception. My family's is a pretty typical story. The grandson of James and Elsie Spears, my paternal great-grandfather Amos, left Oklahoma around 1920 with his family, including his oldest daughter, Pearl, moving from his inadequate primary land allotment in the lush green hill country of Vera, just north of Tulsa, to a larger ranch on the arid prairies of eastern Colorado, land far more suited in size to support what would eventually tally up to 17 children. And all from my great-grandmother. So this was an amazing family. In 1920, Amos joined thousands of other Cherokees who, through choice, desperation, or deception, surrendered their allotments to white settlers and left the nation to build lives elsewhere. I found detailed maps with his allotments, along those with his mother, Mary Jane Spears, brother Dennis, oldest son Edward, and extended Riley kin in close proximity. I've returned in person and driven within viewing distance of those places, now fenced in and inaccessible as somebody else's private land, well marked with no trespassing signs along dirt roads with Confederate flags on prominent display. It's hard not to wonder what the sale of those lands has cost us in the years since, as we scattered across the continent. And still, we return. The land speaks, but even if we listen, we too often don't understand its voices. Even so, there are other ways of understanding these legacies and histories. One of these is by reading the allotment maps. I see these plat maps as something akin to our literature, a set of complex hybrid texts chronicling both indigenous suffering and survivance, texts worthy of contemplation, understanding, even mourning, for they too reveal an aspect of our adaptive defiance and kinship ties too easily lost in simplistic notions of land loss and assimilation. The maps weren't of our own making, imposed as they were by a nation-state hell-bent on our long-term erasure, but even so they reflect the labor that thousands of Cherokees undertook to hold on to some measure of connection and autonomy under brutal circumstances. Labor inscribed in the seemingly endless names written in crisp, clean handwriting across erratic patchwork parcels of land of every size and shape, encompassing nearly all of what would be Northeast Oklahoma. And they, like so much of our literature, are stories that facilitate our return, as much in imagination as embodied experience. So this map is Township 23 North, Range 13 East. This is one of 200 extant plat maps, and for those in the back who can't see, and even I don't know if folks in the front can see very well, all of these squares have somebody's name written on them. So each of these, and they're all of very different sizes. My great-grandfather's primary allotment is right here. And his brother is right next to it, his son is connected. So we have all of these. So this is just a little parcel. He has another one off to the side. But you can see, if you are relying on that amount of land to raise a family, you can't. Not even in lush northeastern Oklahoma. And there are over 200 of these, so we've got so many thousands of people's names on here. These maps do more than simply chart geographic features. They chronicle relationships, names, families, lineages, continuities from and to those relations that have endured since before removal. Amos's main allotment is in section 27, near the now nearly vanished town of Vera. His brother's allotment is directly beside his to the west. His oldest boy, Edward, has 3 fragmented allotments, one directly north of Amos's, one directly south, and another larger tract to the northwest of Dennis's holding. None of these were large enough to make a real living, especially for farmers. To the east and north, they're flanked by related Rileys, even a foreman or two. Amos's second postage stamp allotment is in Township 22 North, Range 17 East, closer to Claremore, not far from the family land holdings of Will Rogers, Lynn Riggs, John Milton Oscarson, and other Cherokee writers. I like to imagine they might have known each other, connecting us across the ages. Hopefully they would have liked him. But we were ornery, so who knows. So just to help give a little bit a clearer sense, so this is Amos's primary allotment. Riley's our family that we're related to. So when I was first learning about allotment, I thought that people's allotments tended to be completely scattered, which generally wasn't the case. You'll often see families very close in proximity, sometimes farther away, but oftentimes if you see a bigger allotment farther from the rest of the family, it could indicate the status of the family relationships, but they didn't really want to be too close to each other. But like I said, Amos had another allotment quite a bit of distance away, and that was very quickly lost. Every map is like this, a two-dimensional mosaic of storied relations on the land, a profound narrative moment at the edge of a transformative epoch in the nation's long history. More than representations of fragmented land holdings and assigned property owners, the maps might be considered cartographic kinscapes that affirm Cherokee relationality with, across, and beyond the physical bounds of the contested territory. As such, they too are documents of aspirational return. While each map is an imperfect abstraction of the land itself, kinship relations are inscribed across the map over top of random and irregular parcels to such an exaggerated degree that the map's artificiality is heightened. While the relationships affirmed by the kinscape are, ironically, rendered more vibrant and real on the maps than the vague marks delineating land parcels. Cherokee readers with familial ties to the names marked on those maps engage the text with varying degrees of relational anticipation. These relations, in turn, connect self and family to specificities of place across time and space. So I'll go back just so you can see the big picture again. The more you know the relationships, the more the maps reveal about the connections and the fracture points, the obligations and the evasions, the ongoing links and the attenuated ties. So we have, as you go farther, we have more relatives, and it kind of peers out that so many families are like that. You see entire families holding on as best they can in a system that was intending this process to destroy those ties. And even so, Cherokees subverted it, or tried to, as did others who were dealing with allotment. To that end, these cartographic kinscapes communicate relational continuity and possibilities of meaningful return in the Cherokee reader, while simultaneously thwarting any hope of narrative closure. There can be no real closure in the ruptured histories and physical displacements explicitly realized by the maps and their colonial purpose. So these maps both invoke and displace kinship. In reading them as maps and family histories, they connect us at the very moment they disrupt those connections. Thousands of names spread across the surfaces of this kaleidoscopic tapestry of letters, numbers, and lines, each representing innumerable connections, divisions, continuities, and ruptures. When you know some of these storied relationships, the kinship patterns inscribed on this representational landscape begin to make sense, though they can never fully capture the reality of the lived experience on the physical land itself. Even in this painful fracturing of the nation, the people clearly maintained their connections and relations as best they could. It's clear that's what my family did, at least for a while. And the more stories we learn, the more we realize just how much folks were able to hold on to, as long as they remained on the land and in specific relation to one another. Of course, once they surrendered those lands, by choice or otherwise, as my great-grandfather did, others stepped in to claim them. And the displacements expanded yet again, even generationally. Old relations were severed, or at least severely stretched. Contiguous family allotments became alienated from one another. New fences went up, new crops were planted, people scattered. Over the past 100 years, the vast majority of these allotments have left Cherokee hands, and with them have gone so many of the deeper relations and meaningful stories that have maintained the nation and kinship ties for so long. Some people stayed and maintained those old fires of family and culture. Some returned in time, reconnecting as best they could in close proximity if possible, but still nearby. Mine is one of the many families that never came back to live in the nation. In the leaving, we left behind the majority of the stories that would have made sense of what happened, of what remained, leaving only a gaping hole in our family consciousness, though not importantly, meaning that nothing remained. And it's vital to emphasize this key point. Not all families left. Not all people disappeared. Not all fires went out. Not even from Georgia. Not even from the east. Many people kept those fires, remaining behind to feed the embers until the flame of nationhood could be stoked again. Those of us whose families left the territory owe those who remained a very deep and lasting debt of gratitude and acknowledgement. Our experiences as dispossessed outlanders is certainly a Cherokee one, but in so many ways, they're of a radically different kind than those of culturally and land-rooted Cherokees. So Amos's oldest daughter, my grandmother Pearl, was a teenager when her family moved to Colorado. Within a few years, she was married and began a family of her own with Jesse Jake Justice, a dark-skinned but bigoted man of ambiguous heritage, who throughout his life insisted he was fully Black Dutch. Not an uncommon claim for people unwilling to admit to indigenous, Black, Jewish, or otherwise other lineage. So this is Pearl with Amos. This is not my grandfather. This is my great-grandfather. Pearl with her father. Pearl would have 4 children before she died at age 39 in a tuberculosis sanatorium in Colorado Springs, including my father, Jimmy. Dad still grieves his mother's death from 3/4 of a century ago. He was just 9 when Pearl went away for treatment and was 14 when she died. In the last few years of her life, he saw little of her due to her declining health and his father's intransigence. Dad was also a small, phenotypically native boy who came of age when being visibly Indian in an explicitly racist society was accompanied by both social disadvantage and material danger. He was defiant and angry, always ready to fight someone who said anything ugly about him being an Indian, as that was the one thing that most characterized his much-loved mother. But while he was always immensely proud of being Indian in an ethnic sense, when growing up he never really had a chance to learn what it was to be culturally Cherokee. This, I think, is the most painful and tangible rupture of all. Had Pearl lived, Dad would likely have stayed more firmly connected with the Spears family, and thus so would we have. He clearly preferred them to his Justice relatives, who it seems were largely unkind, and he tells a really heartbreaking story about his paternal grandmother, who one Christmas when he was about 8 or 9 gave him a bag of dirty marbles, but said they were a gift from Santa. And Dad realized at that moment that Santa didn't exist because Santa would never give dirty marbles to a kid. It was the first of many disappointments Dad would experience as a boy. Even if read through the lens of nostalgia, it seems clear that Pearl was the one truly loving and dependable person in his childhood. The one who called him Sonny Boy, showed him kindness when no one else would, encouraged his fistfighting. When he lost her, he lost the link to a family and a tradition, a people, that might have sustained him in his loneliness. Instead, alcohol and the rootless career of a cross-country trucker would be his life for the better part of 4 decades. In spite of a rich and admittedly complicated life with 4 consecutive wives and children, there's always been a part of Dad that's been closed off and protected, a direct consequence of his mother's death and the loss of everything she represented. But as I grew older, and as an undergraduate began to reach across the generational divide where my grandmother and paternal family once stood, Dad took the journey of return with me. We got our citizenship in the nation at the same time, though I was in my early 20s and he was in his 60s. Even now, when the Cherokee Phoenix arrives in the mail, he chats with me on the phone about it, asking if I too got my Indian paper. He took great joy in getting phone calls from Principal Chief Chad Smith at election time a few years back. Although now with his Alzheimer's dementia, he insists that Chad Smith didn't just call him, but actually came to visit in person to discuss Cherokee politics. And he asked me, he said, "Remember when Chief Smith came to visit?" And I always tell him, "Yes, Dad, I do." It's almost as if he's imaginatively recreating a blood memory of Chief Ross and James Spears in council together at the 1839 Constitutional Convention. He loves hearing all about my trips to Oklahoma, political issues in the nation, my view on the current administration, what our allotments look like today, what work I'm doing on Cherokee writing. And he was delighted that I was coming here, returning to the homeland he's never seen, except in imagination. I'm Cherokee by citizenship, by history, by political relationship, by family lineage, but not by language, culture, groundedness in lands alive with Cherokee significance. What I hold in one hand is absent in the other. So many of us know this ruptured reality in so many communities, so many families and selves. And I've accepted that I'll never have all the stories to knit the pieces of my family's experience together in a seamless whole. But flawless restoration to a state of perceived perfection isn't something I desire. For scars tell their own beautiful and terrible truths. And we can share more than just our stories of suffering and scarring. We can share our strength, our laughter, our love, and our imaginations and literatures make it possible to return as something more than broken memory. For Indigenous peoples the world over, that too is a precious victory. I belong to all of these lines, the intact and the unraveled, the tangled and the torn. Like all human beings, I've inherited some stories that have woven their way into my consciousness of self, but others remain unheard, unspoken, unremembered. But they're waiting for us. There are gaps in our shared kinship that may never be bridged, absences too complete to fill, but there are some frayed edges that knit together with only minor scarring to show. It's in both the honest whole and the honest fragments that our fragile humanity is most beautifully realized. And it's the shared stories and the shared silences together that shape the complicated contours of our narrative selves. By reading the ruptures as well as the presences, the intact as well as the broken, by returning in imagination in ways that might be impossible to do physically, we may come to a humbler sense of wonder and hopefully a generosity toward ourselves and each other, a recognition of the myriad ways our experiences likely shouldn't reach across our differences, but thankfully so often do. It's in that strange alchemy of self and other that we find what matters most. And it's in this sharing of our stories that we realize we're not alone in the struggle, that others too seek to comprehend both the ruptures and the connections, that there is a purpose for resisting settler colonialism and its erasures. Moving across vast stretches of geography and years, and in spite of all the forces that work to keep us silent and broken, disconnected from the world, from ourselves, and from each other, our stories help to restore relations and remind us that we matter. We matter for our own sake and for those of our kin. We matter on our own terms and for those who inherit what we are meant to pass on. We matter because stories abide in living cultures and living peoples, in meaningful places and relations that continue even when the memory is hidden for a time. We carry the hopes, dreams, fears, and fierce determination of those who came before, those who had faith enough to trust in us that we might carry that bundle forward, imperfect as we may be, and continue that act of faith into a future where we belong and where we always have a home to return to. Wado. Thank you.